So here's our play blast with our damping parameter being utilized, and it's noticeable. It's not as fast as it was before, but it's certainly helping us out. And this is all up to your artistic decision. If you felt that the fluid was still moving a bit fast, you could always increase your damping to a higher value. So let's go ahead and hide that smoke for now. Let's go on our perspective view. And we're going to hide our drain as well. Now in the oil smoke lesson, I briefly talked about creating a texture map to emit our density. I talked about it for a little bit. I didn't really go into too much detail, but for this lesson we're going to actually do that. So let's go ahead and create a Lambert. Let's create a noise 2D texture node, and let's adjust its parameters. So if you hit 6 on your keypad, you'll display your textured shaded view. So I'm going to go up in here. We're going to go ahead and we're going to look at our threshold or amplitude. But first, let's change our noise type to space-time. By default, it's set to below. Let's go ahead and make that space-time. Our amplitude, let's give that a value of 0.4. Our ratio, let's just roughly go in and just give it some random values. Let's go with 0.64 for frequency. 2.68 is fine. Let's scroll down. Let's take our frequency down a bit. We give that a value of 3.2. You know what? Let's take that down further. Let's give it a value of 0.8. And now let's just multiply our amplitude a bit higher. Let's give that a value of 4, so our texture can really pop out. Now we can invert it. It's up to you. You can invert it. It all depends on the look of your pattern and what you're happy with. But I'm going to invert it for this test here. Now our time is not like the texture time function in the fluid container. I'll scroll down to the bottom here to talk about the texture time parameter a bit that we have in our fluid container under the texture section. But it works similarly. You can utilize, I want to show you this expression. You could utilize the same expression and apply it to your time setting under your 2D texture node. I'm here scrolling down to the bottom. It's at the very bottom. This is a very long document. But here we go. So here's our texture time. And basically, you're going to be using this attribute to animate your actual texture. So in time, once we type that expression, times the whatever number or value you give it, during that course of frames, its position is going to constantly change. That noise pattern is going to constantly change. So that's pretty neat. So let's go ahead and copy and paste noise 2.time equals times 0.1, and just end it with a semicolon, and that's the value you get. So now you see our pattern there. Once I'm going to play this simulation for you so you can see what it's doing on a frame-to-frame basis. Now Maya's viewport, if you press play, it's not going to update in real time, so you're going to have to go in and stop to update it. So I selected my container. Let's go in and select your fluid emitter, and this is where I mentioned this before. This is where we're going to plug in our texture map. So let's just graph our selection. Let's frame that. Let's go ahead and pull our select our container that's hidden in our layer, and just drag and drop into your density emission map slot, and there you have it. So like we mentioned before, where there are whites is where your 100% value given to density is going to emit from. And notice as I'm playing and stopping, the pattern is changing. So now this is a great thing to do when you're trying to create believable wispy smoke or oil smoke. I didn't actually use this technique for the oil smoke, but imagine if I've done this, I would have gotten even more detail, even more variety in shapes and forms. So real quickly, on my plane geometry, I'm just disabling all the render stats. I don't want it visible. Even though you wouldn't be able to see it under the drain, it's always good to turn off objects that you know are not going to be renderable. So let's go into the render cam. Let's rewind it, and let's turn our fluid back on, and let's do a quick play blast. So the play blasts are done, and let's now compare the previous play blast with the new one. So already I'm seeing noticeable changes. The diameter of the fluid to the right is a lot more noticeable and larger than the one to the left, and this is all because we have that pattern of our texture node being animated. So let's go to frame 110 and compare, and look, it's very noticeable. The one to the left compared to one to the right. Our new one just feels a little bit more natural, feels a little bit more believable, and that's exactly what we were trying to go after. So that's nice. That's very nice. This is moving in a nice direction, and we're almost done. So what we have to do now is go in and start shading this. And this is how I normally work. Once I am happy with the forms and the shapes that we're getting, a resolution should be the least of your concern. This is only a container with a resolution of 150. So by no means is this going to look outstanding when we start to IPR render it, but IPR rendering is going to come in handy because that's going to allow us to try to come up with a combination of properties where we're going to end up being happy with once we set off our final render. So I'm just preparing my scene right now for IPR rendering. I'm taking my anti-aliasing down to -1, my quality. We're going to leave it at 0.8, our shading quality. I also went to shading box mode in my scene just so things can speed up. If a quick tip, if you try to do an IPR render in shaded view, it actually takes longer if you were to do it in bounding box mode. So keep that in mind. Try to always do IPR rendering with bounding box mode activated in your viewport. So here we go. I'm doing a first iteration, and let's go ahead and start tweaking this. So let's decrease our transparency to 0.1 and see what we get. So now it's very thick. It's very thick. So let's take that to 0.85 and see what we get. And now notice we're on the two opposite extremes. So I'm going to maybe finish up around maybe 0.5 and a 0.4 area, but I just wanted to show you the type of look you could get just by tweaking your transparency map under your shading section. So let's go continue down and see what we can tweak further. Let's take a look at our opacity graph. And I'm just going to play with this first swatch and pull that all the way over to the left. And let's take a closer look. Like you'll already notice the extra density that's going to be pulled out just by us pulling our first swatch all the way over to the left. Now if we wanted to match our reference a little bit closer than what we're doing right now, if we wanted to get that secondary pass of smoke, you see how you get that secondary pass? It looks like a second pass, but it's actually how we're tweaking our graph. That's we're creating that illusion. We would go about doing that just by adjusting our opacity this way. So I'm going to go back in and just keep playing with this and try to see how much I may want to bleed out, how much secondary smoke I may want to be visible. But for right now, let's just keep it the way we had it before and go back down to our lighting section. So here under the shadow opacity, I gave it a value of 5, and let's see what that does. So now our shadows are very heavy. So and that's all up to you. It's all dependent on the look of your smoke. If you wanted a very thick, heavy smoke, you can crank that shadow opacity value up. I took it back down to the value of 1.35. I remember when I first started working as an effects artist, I was at MPC working on this very challenging avalanche shot, and I found myself coming up with so many different looks of my smoke. Eventually I had to make up my mind and decide on what kind of look I wanted. But that's what happens when you go in and you play around with your IPR rendering. You're adding all these different values. Sometimes you come up with something really awesome. Sometimes you ruin your fluid, and you have to just go back in and make adjustments. But that's what I really enjoy about the shading part, is going in and playing with different parameters, mixing things, trying to combine settings to see what this setting may do compared to that setting, and just come up with a look that you're happy with. Now right now I'm looking at our resolution. In my notes section I have written down that this is going to be a final res of 400, and by no means don't get discouraged if your machine can't handle a resolution of 400. You're still okay. A resolution of 300 should still be pretty solid. You should be able to get a nice simulation out at a resolution of 300. 200 may not be quite enough, because as you can see here, this is a res of 150. 200 might be a little bit better, but I would recommend 300 and higher. So right now I'm just running through my render globals, making sure segments is selected, my ray tracing is turned on. I'm looking at my light parameters, making sure my ray tracing shadows are turned on. Looking at my values, thinking if I should maybe adjust that, but my fill light's fine. I have that set to 0.3 with a nice blue hue color that I apply to it, and you know, we're in a good place right now. So once you get to this step, you would go in, you change your resolution. You have two options. You can cache your fluid and just set a cache off and render. If you're working in a production pipeline, most likely that's what you're going to have to do. If you're at home and you didn't want to do that and you just wanted to render it right off the bat without caching, that's fine too. But try to get into the habit of caching. That definitely helps. So here's the final simulation at 400. This is, we have our damping parameters we applied. You see our texture map going to work. You see the differences in shapes and forms, and all that comes from us keying our density. Some areas are thicker than others, and that's perfect. If you notice closely, some areas of the drain are emitting smoke, and then 10 frames later they're not emitting smoke, and then 10 frames later you have more densities again, and that's coming from us animating our texture map. So that's great. I mean, all those cool tricks we've applied to our fluid. This is our Wispy smoke final result, and I'm pretty happy with this. So you guys have the scene file. You guys can go in and play around with the settings. You can come up with your own settings. You can, for fun, have it emit from a different object, create a different collision collider for the smoke to create cool shapes. So this is great. If you had a character that you may have want this smoke to emit from, it's all up to you. Well, thanks for watching. See you in the next chapter.